lone girl stood amid endless dunes of snow-white sand. Above the horizon, where the sky should have been, they yawned a dead, starless void. The way was lit only by 7 pale orbs which hung in an arch overhead, though their sickly luminescence was like that of no venerable object of the heavens. 7 ghostly moons cast 7 spectral shadows. The girl tried to cry out into the black infinity, but the void stole all sound from her lips. How many days and nights had she wandered this barren landscape without reprieve? How long since she had last seen the sun? Trembling, she fell to the ground and clawed at the sand, begging the desolate soil to slake her thirst. As if in acquiescence, the innermost moon fractured, and an inky fluid gushed forth, spilling onto the sand. The girl rushed to scoop it up and soothe her parched throat. As soon as she drank it down, she began to cough in pain as the freezing liquid scorched her esophagus. All alone, she withered amid endless dunes of snow-white sand, and all the while, the void watched. 6 baleful moons cast 6 million shadows. Looming above, they seemed to grow and intensify. The chill seeped from her stomach into her arms, into her hands, into her fingers, making them numb and heavy. Were the orbs growing larger, or were they growing closer? She tried to raise her hand to shield her eyes from the merciless gaze, but the hand that entered her vision was misshapen and black as charcoal. Before her eyes, it wilted into a gelatinous mass and fell to the ground. The chill crept into her legs, into her feet, into her toes. Would they begin to decompose now too? Unrelentingly, the celestial spheres bore down upon her. As sensation was expunged from within, the caustic light tormented her from without. Every hope and happiness, every warm feeling, was corroded until it turned noxious. Into her neck, into her head, into her face. The acrid liquid slithered through her veins, permeating bone and soft tissue, dissolving and reforming. Where did she end and the void begin? Ever brighter and closer, the eyes of the abyss burned away every thought and memory, save for the horrible cold. As her body deadened, her eyes burned from the frigid light. With her eyes half open, the girl found herself staring at her bedroom ceiling. With a groan, she curled up on her side and pulled the blanket over her shoulders, waiting for her pounding heart to slow, and watched the motes of dust drift through the sunlight. Night after night, her sleep was fraught with such dreams. They were all she had ever known, all anyone had ever known. And so, every morning, she lay in bed and waited for them to evaporate with the morning dew. Once her body had calmed and the anxieties of the night had dissipated, she pulled herself from the covers and trundled into the washroom to confront the anxieties of the day. Dunking a washcloth into a basin half filled with well water, she wiped her face up and down and then stared morosely into the mirror. As wretched as her nightmares were, she always appeared within them the way she thought she ought to. A great change was occurring within her body, and she was powerless to stop it. Her once dark hair was now bleached white as snow, and only a single lock retained its original color. She ran her hand through it, inspecting it closely. Had it diminished since yesterday? Leaning towards the mirror, she peered directly into her right eye and pulled down slightly on the bottom eyelid. Not a trace of the original pigmentation remained. The entire iris had become a deep blood red. Would it begin to turn now too, the way the left one had? More than anything, that saffron yellow slitted feline eye was a constant reminder of the unnatural metamorphosis afflicting her. Though she had experienced some changes to her vision, it wasn't any particular functional deficiency that depressed her, but the feeling that she was losing territory within her own body to an unknown foreign mechanism. It was precisely because she didn't know where this road led that it frightened her. Stepping away from the mirror, she held out her right hand, fingers splayed, and looked at the scar incised on its back. This is where it all began, the source of her despair. That inelegant lump of gashes was the root, a mark of the divine, a sigil of the profane. Though the rest of the past may be shrouded in darkness, of this she was certain. Like the scar, that single memory was irrevocably etched into her body, an act of great defilement and an act of violence. With a suitable implement, she had cut the invader from her flesh, and though it may have spared her an even more lamentable fate, it was insufficient. She had been contaminated. If only she could remember further, beyond the aphotic veil, perhaps somewhere there was a hint that could lead her to her salvation. That cold, fragrant, cacophonic darkness. Her thoughts began to spin in a vortex of terror, and within that vortex, the abyss stared back. This was the source of all her fear. A nucleus of catastrophe. A nascent madness. A lucid nightmare. Shaking her head forcefully, she managed to return to her senses. Leaning against the wall, she wiped the cold sweat from her forehead with a trembling hand. This was the curse of the forgotten. The past was forever locked away. Just as they had been forgotten by the world, so too had they forgotten it. Upon investigating her pantry, she again became despondent. Scarce remained of her provisions, beside dried herbs and spices. If she wanted to eat breakfast, she would have to go into the market. She hated going to the market, or anywhere with people for that matter. Unfortunately, her body still required food to sustain operation. Resigning herself to the task, she gathered up her knapsack and coin purse and donned her shawl and wide-brimmed sun hat. As she stepped outside, she squinted as the morning sunlight momentarily blinded her. It wasn't so much that she disliked people as it was that they disliked her. Her otherworldly appearance made her a social pariah, but it wasn't even that she looked different in and of itself that earned their enmity. Everyone she passed was walking with their eyes fixed to the ground. This wasn't because of the glaring sunlight. They all feared the sky. What remained of the human race bore an ingrained trauma, and the sky was the origin. She had been touched by the cosmos. The people around her knew it, and so they shunned her, lest the cosmos reach out and touch them too. To the best that anyone could recall, the calamity began roughly a decade ago. Beings which would come to be known as the Exalted Ones descended from the stars, and the world was flung into chaos. The events that transpired during their occupation are lost within a deeply unnatural repression. What is known is that they significantly tampered with the world and the biology of those living on it. Then, around 5 years ago, as suddenly as they came, they vanished. The world left in their wake was unrecognizable. Those who were stayed physical transformation, those unworthy masses overlooked by the Exalted Ones, nevertheless beheld divinity, thus their minds were corrupted. Their erudition and history receded beyond an impermeable haze, and they came to call themselves the Forgotten. Many others were not so fortunate. Beyond the fringe of what remained of human civilization, inspired cities hewn from volcanic glass and crystal dwell an enigmatic caste known as the Beautiful Ones. Divested of their corporeal forms, their kin were made to inhabit mechanical constructs. Their exteriors are adorned in porcelain and precious metals such as gold and platinum, and they are said to conduct themselves with measured bearing. Due to their reclusive nature, little else is known, and it is unclear whether they have retained any form of language, culture, or intellect. And then there are the Blessed Children, those chosen few who received divine benediction and reside among the clouds. Their pearlescent floating cities can be seen alit at dusk, but out of reach as they are, they're otherwise a complete mystery. Looking up, she sighed. What then was she? An anomaly, perhaps? Her eyes drifted eventually to the southern sky. 3 weeks had passed since a strange new star had appeared there. Shining brightly even during the day, it had been dubbed the Wanderer's Star. Believed by most to be an ill omen, the people had redoubled their resolve to avoid making eye contact with anything above the horizon line. Out here in the northern country, it appeared always to point towards the star veil in the south. An ominous portent indeed. Making an attempt to be as inconspicuous as possible, she wove her way through the morning throng. Failure in the former eased the latter, as anyone who had awareness of their surroundings subtly shifted course to avoid her. She followed the scent of simmering street food past stalls of drab textiles and austere craftworks until her nose caught the pungent scents wafting inland from the fish market down by the harbor. The street was lined with vendors exhibiting sundry foodstuffs, sizzling meat skewers, salted jerky, soups and curries, loaves of bread, sacks of grain and flour, fruits and vegetables, bundles of herbs and bins of spices. Timidly, she approached a stall selling baked goods and pointed to a loaf of rye bread. Eyeing her wearily, the vendor weighed the loaf. 76 checks, he grunted. The girl fished the requisite amount out of her coin bag and placed it on the counter. When the vendor seemed satisfied that they weren't fake, he handed her the loaf. Having completed the transaction, she took her bread and made a hasty retreat. She was perusing a vegetable stand when a particular conversation caught her ear. It was common to learn about the latest happenings in other towns here at the market. In fact, many gathered here for just that purpose. Information came to the village from travelers or caravans, and it inevitably ended up circulating the marketplace. Gone? That's what I heard. Are you sure? No, I'm not sure. I'm just telling you what I heard from a merchant. It's true. A gruff third voice entered the conversation. Got a brother-in-law stationed out there who saw it himself. Ever since that blasted Wanderer's Star showed up, he said the star veil just disappeared. Do you think the palace is gonna do anything about it? Surely they'll do something. Oh, I reckon they sent troops or something. Not much folk like us can do at any rate. The star veil. That mysterious etheric shroud which sealed away the southern continent. What lies within its borders, no one knows. None have ever crossed the star veil's boundary and returned. However, it is a land held in fearful reverence. A land of darkness. Ground zero of the Eldritch incursion. The throne of the Exalted Ones. Was it really gone? Had that forbidden land truly been unsealed? Deep within the recesses of her mind, something stirred. Just for an instant, a spark flickered, and scenes long concealed in shadow were illuminated. One thought remained in her mind. She must go. Within that uncharted land lay the seat of the Providence and, perhaps, the key to the past. She dared not to hope, and yet a small hope had begun to take root. If she went and the rumors proved false, so be it. But if the star veil truly was gone? With all the celerity she could muster, she finished her shopping and returned home. As it happened, a caravan was departing for Orcus tomorrow morning. As much as she wanted to begin packing right away, it was approaching noon, and her stomach was growling. She filled her small cooking pot that sat over the sunken hearth with water and set to dicing the vegetables she had bought. Setting the last of her tinder in the fire pit, she began to strike together her flint striker and fire steel, but no matter how many times she tried, she couldn't get the tinder to ignite. Had it gotten damp somehow? She went outside to gather a small handful of twigs and tried for several more minutes, but to no avail. She was loath to do it, but given the numerous setbacks she had already encountered this morning, she would use her last resort. The sole boon, if one could call it that, from the loathsome transformation her body was undergoing, was the strange power she had acquired with it. Regretfully, using it seemed to accelerate the degeneration process, so she avoided doing so unless absolutely necessary. All she needed was a small fire. It wouldn't take much. She closed her eyes and concentrated. In her mind, she extended a hand to touch the kindling in the hearth. Before she discovered its cost, she had used its power more freely and had learned some of its rules and limitations. Interactions with external objects seemed to require channeling through an imaginary connecting medium. Though she usually imagined using her hand, it wasn't strictly necessary to do so. She could envision her arm as a tentacle, a creeping vine, or even as a wisp of smoke. The sense of tactile contact seemed to be the crucial determinant. With this power, she had learned to manipulate and move objects and change their temperature, though there were limits to the amount of weight she could lift or the absolute temperature she could induce. From her incorporeal fingertips, heat flowed into the twigs. As it did, the warmth was sapped from her astral hand. Using this power always felt so cold. No matter how she used it, it always left the phantom limb with the sensation of having been doused in icy water. She heard a crackle and could feel the warmth against the fingers of her real hand. She carefully stoked the flame until the firewood began to smolder. She put the cut-up vegetables along with herbs and seasoning into the pot and boiled them until they turned soft and the broth thickened. Then she warmed the flatbread, cut it into wedges, and poured her soup into a ceramic bowl. As she ate her meal, her eyes wandered around the room, and she was gradually filled with a sense of melancholy. Perhaps one day, if she was ever cured of her affliction, she would return. Either that, or she would come crawling back in consummate defeat. She tried to banish the thought. That night, she packed the supplies she would need to travel, and in the morning, she departed. The caravanners had begun to congregate at the village's southern entrance when she arrived. Several merchants were loading their cargo into ox carts, while others were yoking the animals. As the girl ran through a mental checklist of her supplies, a gravelly voice hailed her from behind. She almost jumped when she turned around and saw a rather tall man in a strange leather costume. He was clad head to toe. Black gloves, black boots, black breeches, black overcoat, a black, wide-brimmed hat, and a bizarre beaked mask.
My apologies. I meant not to startle you,
the man said.
I noticed your travel gear, and couldn't help but ask if you too were bound for the southern continent.
The girl meekly nodded.
I see, he exclaimed. Quite exciting, is it not? One must surely have chaos within oneself to plunge so readily into the heart of darkness. You have it within yourself, don't you? That willingness to cast aside all in the pursuit of a great truth?
Becoming conscious of her appearance, she shrank. My eyes and my hair aren't normal, right? She said, pointing timidly at herself. I thought that somewhere in there, maybe there's a way to fix them. At least, I hope so.
I see.
He nodded understandingly. Could I ask you something? The girl inquired.
Ah, you wish to inquire about my strange choice of wardrobe, perhaps?
She nodded hesitantly.
Long ago, it was worn by the doctors who battled a horrible plague that ravaged the world. As it happens, I too am a doctor, and I too am battling a plague. Ah, but the fools!
He turned with a flourish.
In their ignorance, the tinctures and treatments they prepared did more to harm than to heal. We too are fools, all of us, for we have lost our wisdom. We have forgotten ourselves. Until the day we regain our erudition, until the day we cure this plague of ignorance, I will don the image of the foolish doctor that I am.
It was his first words, more than anything, that caught her attention. You remember the past? She asked, her eyes widening.
Only but a little, he replied. If one can withstand the darkness, one may be able to grasp at the light beyond.
He extended a hand towards the sky and clenched it. Wasn't it scary? She asked. Was it painful?
Of course, but that is what one must do, to burn thyself in thine own flame. How can one rise anew if one has not first become ashes?
This man was different from the others. As he had said, there existed within her a chaos that roiled and festered. As he had said, she sensed it within him too, a longing to regain what was lost, to go beyond the darkness, to seek the truth, even if that darkness would devour her, even if that truth would become a light to sear her very flesh. If you don't mind, she stammered, since we both have the same destination, would you mind if we traveled together for a while?
I would welcome the company, he replied. Ah yes, there's one more reason I wear this mask, he said, tapping on the beak. Come close. Can you smell anything?
She took a couple steps forward as he had asked and leaned in slightly. Indeed, she could vaguely make out a sweet aroma. Lavender and peppermint? She asked.
Indeed, he said. Doctors of the time believed sickness to spread through noxious air called miasma. They put perfumes in the beak, which they thought would fumigate and neutralize it. This is my own weakness, a darkness I cannot bear. Stare too long into the abyss, and it will stare back into you. Surely you've heard it. Surely you've smelled it. It's that stench that I can't forget. Like rotting flowers, like blossoming carrion, like a dying star, like a poisoned dream. This is all I can do to allay it. Once you are awake, you shall remain awake eternally. Are you sure you are prepared?
I think I'm sure, she proclaimed. No matter how the darkness consumed her, no matter how the light scorched her, until her very soul burned away, she would press on. I'm Sebastian, by the way, he said. Mel, she replied. A pleasure, Mel. Mel looked out of the vista to the south as she curled her remaining lock of dark hair around her finger. You know, Sebastian remarked, I've heard that travelers who have seen the land beyond the veil have begun to call it by a new name. From the front of the caravan, someone was yelling to let the other travelers know that it was beginning to move.
"Well then, let us be off,"
Sebastian declared.
"Onward, to the wild south."